Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is November 21st, 2025, about 7:05 p.m., where I'm at right now. And we are continuing our Booked React series where we read an entire text cover to cover, and this is book 17 in the series, episode 1 of A History of Psychology, From Antiquity to Modernity. This is the 8th edition of this book, written by the professor Thomas Hardy Leahey. Now, the reason I'm reading this book is that currently I'm a student in the Bachelor's Sociology English program at a university out here in Budapest, Hungary, and I'm taking a course currently on the history of psychology. It's a lecture course done by one of the professors. I think his name is Balash. I can't remember his last name right now. But the course is actually only like 4 classes, and each class is like 3 hours long, and I missed one of the classes. The classes aren't mandatory to attend, but the finals are coming up soon, and I want to get a good grade. So I'm going to do a Book to React series reading this entire text because, number one, I find psychology interesting. 2, like I said, I want to get a good grade. 3, my wife is a psychologist. She got her master's in psychology from a university out here in Budapest as well. So why not also learn about what my wife learned about, so I could have something to talk about with her when we go on our broke dates. So we're going to be reading this text. This is probably going to be a very long series of the Book to React series, because this text is well over 500 pages long. It's a textbook. So yeah, we're going to take our time with this, slowly roast it, and hopefully it helps somebody out there who is studying psychology or is interested in the history of psychology. As far as Thomas Hardy Leahey, I could not find a picture of him online. I don't know if he is still alive or if he is just internet phobic. But I cannot find any picture of this person online. But this book is published by Routledge, a very well-known and distinguished publisher, so I'm sure he is well-regarded. So regardless, we're going to jump into the text now. We're going to be reading for about 45 minutes, maybe 50 minutes or so, and then we're going to be continuing tomorrow with another hour of reading. There is a timeline here that matches up European history mostly to events in psychology. We're going to be skipping over that because it's hard to read and translate that into the format of this type of video, but we will be reading this section right here, A History of Psychology. A History of Psychology places social, economic, and political forces of change alongside psychology's internal theoretical and empirical arguments, illuminating how the external world has shaped psychology's development, and in turn, how the late 20th century psychology has shaped society. Featuring extended treatment of important movements such as the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution, the textbook approaches the material from an integrative rather than wholly linear perspective. The text carefully examines how issues in psychology reflect and affect concepts that lie outside the field of psychology's technical concerns as a science and profession. This new edition features expanded attention on psychoanalysis after its founding, as well as new developments in cognitive science, artificial intelligence, and behavioral economics. Throughout the book strengthens its exploration of psychological ideas and the culture in which they developed, and reinforces the connections between psychology, modernism, and postmodernism. The textbook covers scientific, applied, and professional psychology and is appropriate for higher-level undergraduate and graduate students. So that's a little short introduction to this text. Let us know if you think this is something that you'll be interested in up in the comments. Be sure to like and subscribe. We got to remember, this is YouTube, baby. So, on to Thomas Hardy Leahey. He is a professor emeritus at Virginia Commonwealth University in the United States. He has been the president of the Society for Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology and the Society for the History of Psychology. He is a fellow of the American Psychological Association and a founding fellow of the Association for Psychological Science. Okay. So maybe that's why he didn't have his pictures out there. Maybe he knows, after deep study in psychology, that this is bad for your mental. Anyway, this book was published in 2018 though the original version, the first edition, was published in 1987. Okay? So here's the table of contents. We're going to skip over that. Skip over the table of contents right here. Okay? All right, a lot to cover here. Damn, there's a lot of chapters. How many chapters in total? About 14. Okay, yeah, a lot of chapters here. Anyway, let's go. Taylor and Francis, yeah. All right, here's the preface to the 8th edition. This new edition of A History of Psychology has taken longer than usual to appear because of a change in publisher from Pearson to Routledge. This move has, however, allowed me profitable time to research and write new material and rewrite older material that was awkwardly phrased, misleading, or out of date. Throughout, I have updated a lot, especially by adding paragraphs illustrating how psychological ideas have been shaped by the cultures in which they developed, strengthening a major theme of this book. For example, in Chapter 2, I discuss how early Christians, wrestling with the problem of the expiation of sin, a concern unknown to pagans, deepened the mind-body problem bequeathed it by the Greeks and Romans. I have also worked to clarify and advance my contention that as a science, psychology was a product of modernism and a maker of postmodernism by rewriting the boxes and reinforcing their linkages to the main narratives of the text. Larger changes include, at the request of the reviewers, I have expanded my treatment of psychoanalysis as a movement past its founding by Freud in chapters 9 and 14. In the chapter on cognitive science, chapter 12, I have added sections on important recent developments, including the appearance of embodied cognition theorists who reject the information processing view of the mind, seeking to replace it with a radical behaviorism-like view, emphasizing bodily doing over inner thinking. Recent breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, such as building computers that are structured like the brain, and the deep learning algorithms fundamental to social media and driverless cars. The rise of behavioral economics, a fusion of economics and psychology, whose findings are being used by social policy wonks at the highest levels of government to manage human behavior in the postmodern world, as in the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, in the U.S. I have added sections called Crisis, calling attention to critical developments in both scientific and applied psychology. In Chapter 12 on cognitive science, I discuss the important recent discovery that many seemingly established and importantly, widely reported psychological research findings fail to reproduce, casting doubt on the always dodgy status of psychology as a science. Let's repeat that. In Chapter 12 on cognitive science, I discussed the important recent discovery that many seemingly established and, importantly, widely reported psychological research findings fail to reproduce, casting doubt on the always dodgy status of psychology as a science. I was thinking about that today in class. I was taking a class today called Sociology of Communication, and they were talking about the Bandura doll experiment. That's the experiment where a bunch of kids watch adults beat up on the doll, and then when the kids are left alone, they beat up on the doll just like the adults did. And I was thinking, is that always true? Could that experiment happen today? Does that happen across cultures? Does that, happen at generally the same age levels like it did back then? I don't know. Anyway, in Chapter 14 on the Psychological Society, I discussed the black eye received by the discovery of the American Psychological Association's complicity in the conduct of torture on detainees at Guantanamo Bay. I swear, wherever there's torture, wherever the American empire is, you will find a psychologist. Wherever the American empire is, you will find a psychologist. And the American psychologists were down there in Guantanamo talking about, turn that M&M up even louder. Sleep deprivation doesn't cause permanent damage. Revealing the temptations of power to practitioners of what considers itself to be a benign helping profession. As the British Lord Acton said, power corrupts. As the British Lord Acton said, power corrupts. I hope you find this new edition useful. Let me know what you think at tleahey@vc.edu. Thomas Hardy Leahey, Professor Emeritus, Virginia Commonwealth University, Richmond, Virginia, USA, March 26, 2017 is when he wrote that letter and where. Now we're going to jump into part one, psychology. Let's jump right in. Let's go. Introduction. Understanding science. Plato observed that philosophy begins in wonder. Science also begins in wonder. Wonder at the inner workings of nature, and all sciences, including psychology, were originally part of philosophy. Over the centuries, the special sciences gradually became independent of philosophy. Psychology was one of the last of the special sciences to separate from the parents, remaining part of philosophy until the 19th century. The founders of psychology were philosophers as well as psychologists, attempting to find scientific answers for many philosophical questions. The psychology means psych logos, literally the study of the soul, though the term was not coined until the 17th century and was not widely used until the 19th century. Philosophers and religious teachers around the world have wrestled with the nature of the soul. Does the soul exist? What is its nature? What are its functions? How is it related to the body? While psychologists resist the term soul, preferring the less religiously loaded term mind, they have continued to address these vexing questions. Even psychologists who define psychology not as a study of the mind, but as a study of behavior, have different answers to these questions. Since the time of the ancient Greeks, philosophers have inquired into how human beings know the world. This enterprise is called epistemology, from the Greek word episteme, knowledge, and logos, discourse. Asking how human beings know the world involves questions about sensation, perception, memory, and thinking, the whole realm of what psychologists call cognitive psychology. Ethics is another area shared by philosophers and religious thinkers and psychologists. Although ethics is centrally concerned with how people ought to act, practical ethics depends on a conception of human nature. Are people by nature good? What motives do people have? Which ones are wholesome and which ones should be repressed? Are people social by nature? Is there a common good life all humans ought to live? Such questions are profoundly psychological and can be informed by scientific research on human nature. Ethical concerns manifest themselves in many areas of psychology. In scientific psychology, we find them in the studies of motivation and emotion, social behavior, and sexual behavior. Applied psychology, whether in business, industry, government, or in individual, clinical, and counseling psychology, is deeply involved in human ethics. People come to psychologists wanting to be happier or more productive, seeking the psychologist's scientifically informed help. The psychologist's knowledge of motivation, emotion, learning, and memory gives him or her tools to change behavior, but the psychologist must not be merely the client's servant. A business consulting psychologist may need to tell a client that he or she is the problem in the company, and no ethical psychologist would teach a con artist how to improve his or her self-presentation skills. Science is traditionally value neutral in pursuing the secrets of nature, but as Francis Bacon said, knowledge is power, and the tools of the applied scientists must be rightly used. Although the conceptual foundations of psychology are to be found in philosophy, the inspiration for the creation of an independent science of psychology came from biology. The idea that the functions philosophers and others ascribe to the mind, dependent on underlying processes of the brain, have been fitfully entertained since the days of the Greeks, but had attained the status of a conviction by the mid-19th century. The founders of psychology hoped that, by taking a path to the mind through physiology, what had been speculative philosophy and religion might become naturalistic science. A younger branch of biology, evolution, also shaped the founding of scientific psychology, especially in Britain and America. Philosophers and psychologists began to ask what the mind was good for in the struggle for existence. That was evolution by natural selection. Why should we be conscious at all? Were animals conscious? These new questions would disturb, yet animate psychologists from the beginning. Therefore, we will be concerned not just with the abstract questions of philosophy, but with the growing understanding of the brain and nervous systems from the classical era to the present. So here's a picture here going to figure 1. When William Wundt proclaimed the founding of psychological science, he said it was the outcome of an alliance between philosophical psychology and the new science of physiology. While this ambition proved premature, it is now coming to fruition in cognitive neuroscience, which uses methods undreamed of by Wundt to connect mind and brain. Interesting. So I wonder if William Wundt was the man who coined the term psychology. Modes of scientific explanation. From the 19th century onward, there has been general agreement that psychology is, or at least ought to be, a science. The nature of science, what psychology aspires to be, is a good starting point for understanding it. People expect science to explain how and why the world, the mind, and the body work as they do. Philosophy of science tries to understand how science works. The modern style of scientific explanation began with Isaac Newton and the scientific revolution. Let's go to box 1-1, positivism. Positivism was a self-consciously modern movement, and thus part of modernism even before the term came into use. It began with a rather eccentric Frenchman named Auguste Comte, born 1798 and died 1857, and his positive philosophy. It wasn't positive in the sense of positive psychology, but positive in a philosophical way. His enemy was speculative philosophy that trucked with unseen things like gods and forms, and he wanted to replace it with a philosophy based on directly observable, positive facts, if there are such things. He saw human history as passing through three stages, the first two of which were based on speculative philosophy. During the theological stage, people thought that gods caused events, and the natural rulers of society were thus priests, who supposedly understood the gods and could entreat or control them to human advantage. The second stage was the metaphysical stage. Perhaps, or at least the elite, the second stage was the metaphysical stage. People, or at least the elite, no longer believed that gods controlled the world, but did believe in unseen essences and forces that did. The natural rulers were thus kings and aristocrats. The elites who understood these hidden truths. We'll meet them as Plato's guardians in the next chapter. The last, modern stage was the scientific stage. Gods and metaphysics were jettisoned for Newtonian science, which understood the genuine causes of events and which could therefore really deliver the goods for human welfare in a way that priests and aristocrats could only fake to their own interest rather than humanity's. The natural rulers would thus be scientists, specifically the scientists whose expertise was society itself, sociologists. Psychologists would count themselves among the number of the new elite. As founding psychologist James McKean Cattell wrote, scientific men should take the place that is theirs as masters of the modern world, quoted by Herman in 1996, page 55. So essentially, positivism is the idea that, psychology, sociology, the human sciences should follow like a scientific type of path. You shouldn't be concerned with these ethereal, unseen things, metaphysical things. We are only concerned with hard data, science, etc. And Auguste Comte, Frenchman, he believed three stages of human development. Theological stage were ruled by the priest, metaphysical stage were ruled by the king, and lastly, the scientific stage where we're ruled by the scientists. So, going here, the nomological approach, explanation by laws of nature. Newton defined his scientific enterprise as the search for a small number of mathematical laws from which one could deduce observed regularities in nature. His domain was the physics of motion, which he proposed to explain in terms of three laws of motion and a law of gravity, and he showed how his laws could precisely account for the movement of the bodies in the solar system. As an example of the Newtonian style of explanation, we will take the law of gravity. Between any two bodies, there is a mutually attracting force whose strength is inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Newton was criticized by his contemporaries for failing to provide any mechanism to explain how gravity worked. To them, action at a distance between two objects smacked of magic. Newton, however, replied, hypothesis non fingo. I do not feign, or I do not propose hypotheses. Newton refused in his principle of gravity. For him, it was sufficient to postulate a force from which one could predict the motion of the heavenly bodies. So basically, Newton said, it is what it is, bruh. With Newton began a new philosophy for understanding nature that was later codified in an extreme form by Auguste Comte, born 1798, died 1857, and his followers, the positivists, see chapter 7, who said science worked because of the Newtonian style of remaining as close as possible to the observable facts and as far as possible from hypothetical explanations. Thus, the basic job of science is description rather than explanation. Scientists are supposed to closely observe nature, looking for regular occurrences and relatable correlations. On the basis of their observations, scientists will propose scientific laws, such as Newton's law of gravity. Extending Newton's reluctance to frame hypotheses, positivists understood scientific laws to be mathematical summaries of past observations rather than truths of nature. Interesting. So, from the first function of science, description, ideally summarized as laws, arises the second function, prediction. Using Newton's law of gravity and his three laws of motion, scientists could predict future events such as eclipses and the return of comets. Finally, prediction from laws made control of nature possible. Using Newton's laws, engineers could calculate the thrust required to throw satellites into precise orbits around the Earth and send probes to the distant planets. Knowledge, as Francis Bacon said, is power, and control was the ultimate rationale for science in the positivist philosophy. Comte looked forward to the scientific rule of society and the desire to apply scientific psychological expertise to Comte's project played an important role in shaping 20th century psychology. Now, I find it interesting that he's saying, like, after Newton said this, people could now control nature. While people might not have had the language or interpreted it in different ways, wouldn't you say the ancient Egyptians understood nature, which is how they were able to design the pyramids and their forms of irrigation that made their civilization thrive for thousands of years? Couldn't you say the ancient Maya, the Olmecs, the Aztecs understood nature when they were building their megaliths that aligned with the stars, and even going to the ancient Romans, right, who built aqueducts to have water travel miles and miles across continents? You know what I mean? So I'm just saying, the control of nature was now possible with the predictive laws of Newton's scientific inquiries. I feel like I understand what he's saying. I mean, we have this language to say this, but I feel like it's always been present since humans have been building civilization, I would say. But I will continue. Description, prediction, and control were the only three functions assigned to science by the first positivists. They regarded the human desire for explanations, answers to why questions, as a dangerous temptation to indulge in metaphysical and theological speculation. However, in 1948, the contemporary era of philosophical understanding of explanation began with the publication of Studies in the Logic of Explanation by two logical positivists, Carl Hempel and Paul Oppenheim. Their epoch-making paper showed a way of incorporating an explanatory function for science within the positivist framework. And despite its age and defects, the Hempel-Oppenheim model of explanation remains the starting point for all subsequent studies of explanation in science. Hempel and Oppenheim proposed that scientific explanations could be regarded as logical arguments in which the event to be explained, the explanandum, could be deduced from the explanus or the explanans, relevant scientific laws, and the observed initial conditions. So a physicist would explain a solar eclipse by showing that, given the relative position of sun, moon, and earth sometime before the eclipse, one could use Newton's laws of motion and gravity to deductively predict their arrival into an eclipse-producing alignment. Since Hempel and Oppenheim said that explanations are deductions from scientific laws, their scheme is called the deductive nomological, from the Greek nomos, law, the deductive nomological model of explanation. It is also called the covering law model of explanation, since an explanation shows how an event is subsumed or covered under some set of scientific laws. Certain features of the Hempel-Oppenheim model are important. First, it makes explicit a central and crucial feature of explanation that I will call the iron law of explanation. The explanandum may not be contained explicitly or implicitly in the explanans. Violation of this rule renders an explanation null and void on grounds of circularity. An example borrowed from the French playwright Molière illustrates a circular explanation. Imagine asking, "Why does somatol make me sleepy?" and receiving the reply, "Because it possesses the soporific power." At first glance, this appears to be an explanation of one thing, sleepiness, in terms of another, soporific power. And indeed, stated forcefully in an advertisement, it might be able to pass itself off as one. However, when we learn that soporific means sleep-inducing, we see that the proffered explanation is empty because it says, in effect, somatol makes you sleepy because it makes you sleepy. The explanandum causing sleep was implicitly contained in the explanans, so the explanation was circular. The iron law is easy to violate because we often think when we have named something the soporific power that we have explained it, because much of the mind cannot be observed. Violating the iron law is especially easy in psychology. We may think we have explained why someone is shy and has few friends by calling him or her an introvert. But all we have done is given a shorthand label to a person who is shy and has few friends. If introversion is to be a real explanation of being shy, it must be linked to something other than shy behavior, perhaps to a genetic predisposition. A more controversial feature of the deductive nomological model is that it sees prediction and explanation as the same thing. In the Hempel-Oppenheim model, the explanation of an event consists of showing that it could have been predicted. Thus, an astronomer predicts an eclipse in the year 2010, but explains one in the year 1010. In each case, the procedure is the same, applying the laws of motion to the states of the sun, moon, and earth, and demonstrating the inevitability of the eclipse. However, the thesis that explanation and prediction are symmetrical runs into important problems. Consider a flagpole and its shadow. If one knows the height of a flagpole and the position of the sun, one can deduce and so predict the length of the shadow from the laws governing light and the rules of geometry. And it seems reasonable to say that we have thereby explained the length of the shadow. But by the same token, however, if we know the length of the shadow, we can deduce and so predict the height of the flagpole. But surely the length of the shadow does not explain the height of the flagpole. The causal approach. Laws are not enough. The covering law model for scientific explanation deliberately avoids questions about the real causal structure of nature, preferring to focus instead on how we can predict and control nature. Usable knowledge need not pretend to be profound or true. Although how aspirin works is only now being understood, physicians have long prescribed it to relieve pain, inflammation, and fever. Following Newton, who refused to worry about why his laws of motion were true, positivists demand of scientific explanations only that they make successful predictions, not that they reveal why they do so. Discomfited by the shortcomings of the positivist approach, some philosophers want science to probe deeper, telling us not merely how nature works as it does, but why it works as it does. The main rival of the positivist approach to explanation is the causal approach. Its starting point is the difficulty of identifying explanation with prediction. Although we can deduce the height of a flagpole from the length of its shadow, shadows cannot cause anything, and so they should not be cited in explanations. In contrast, objects blocking rays from the sun causally cast shadows. The mere existence of a predictive regularity is not the same as a law of nature, no matter how reliable and useful the regularity may be. The generalization, when the reading on a barometer drops, a storm will occur, states a useful correlation, not a causal law of nature. More importantly, for the explanation of human behavior, we intuitively accept explanations that cite no laws at all. When in the last chapter of a murder mystery, the detective unravels the crime, explaining who did it, how and why he or she will not invoke laws of nature. Instead, he or she will show how a series of particular unique events led, one after the other, to the commission of murder. We feel satisfied to learn that Lord X was murdered by his son to pay his gambling debts, but there is no law of nature saying all or even most sons with gambling debts will kill their fathers. Much explanation in everyday life and history is of this type, connecting events in a causal sequence without the mention of laws. Not all satisfying explanations fit the covering law model. From the causal perspective, the positivist fear of falling into metaphysics and their consequent unwillingness to ever stray beyond the facts that have led them to miss the point of science and to ignore important intuitions about the nature of explanation. Instead of shunning metaphysics, the causal approach embraces it, arguing that the goal of science is to penetrate the causal structure of reality and discover, not just invent, the laws of nature. Science is successful, they say, because it is more or less right about how nature works, and it gains predictive power and control from being true, not from being logically organized. Science protects itself from the positivist bugaboo, superstition, by rigorously wresting every hypothesis and challenging every theory. Nevertheless, the causal view has its own weakness. For example, how can we ever be certain we have grasped the causal structure of the world when it lies, everyone concedes, beyond the reach of observation? Because we cannot directly verify our hunches about real causes, they might be a metaphysical luxury that ought not be judged, no matter how tempting. The debate between the causal and epistemic accounts of scientific explanation is not over. All right, so that was interesting. I got to mull on this a lot more. These are very deep, even though these are like basic foundational things, like the nomological deductive method and the causal explanations of things, the causal approach. Even though these are very basic standards of the social sciences, I'm still imbibing them, putting them in my mind. We get the same education in the sociology department too, but it's still, I'm still in the learning stages, right? I'm still humble enough to say I'm still grasping these things as we go. And that's why we do these book to react series. I'm learning with y'all, all right? Continuing in situating psychology. Are explanations true or merely useful? The difference between the nomological and causal approaches to explanation is a deep one because they rest upon competing ideas about what science can achieve. Nomological theorists believe that all we can hope to do is describe the world as we find it. Causal theorists believe we can go deeper, penetrating the hidden causal structure of the universe. In philosophy of science, this argument is known as the debate over realism in science. The dispute may be historically illustrated by the late 19th century debate regarding the existence of atoms. Since the late 18th century, widespread acceptance had been gained by the theory that various observable phenomena, such as the behavior of gases and the regularities governing the combination of chemical elements, could best be explained by supposing that objects were composed of infinitesimally small particles called atoms. Yet, how to interpret the concept of atoms remained unclear. In one camp were the positivists, led in this battle by the distinguished physicist Ernest Mach, born 1839, died 1916, who argued that because atoms could not be seen, belief in their existence was faith, not science. He said atoms should be regarded, at best, as hypothetical fictions whose postulations made sense of data, but whose existence could not be confirmed. The atomic camp was led by Russian chemist Dmitry Mendeleev, born 1834, died 1907, who believed atoms were real things whose properties and interactions explained the regularities of the periodic table he had invented. I didn't know. Did Mendeleev invented the periodic table? Okay, I didn't know that. Mendeleev's view is a realist view of inferred entities and processes. Behind observations lies a realm of unseen but real things about which science theorizes. Observations are regarded as evidence for the underlying causal structure of the universe. Mach's positivist view is an anti-realist view of science, regarding observations themselves as the only thing science need explain. Anti-realists come in agnostic and atheistic brands. The most common form of anti-realism is instrumentalism, which holds that scientific theories are merely tools, instruments by which human beings come to grips with nature. If a theory predicts and explains events, we retain it as useful. If it fails to predict and explain, we discard it. We should ask no more of theories. At stake is the possibility of attaining truth in science. Realists say that science should strive to give us a true picture of the causal structure of the universe. Anti-realists say that science should strive to give us conceptual tools that enable us to deal with the universe. In short, the realists want truth, the anti-realists want usefulness. I would say I'm more of an anti-realist then. Yeah, in my opinion, objective truth is very, 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 very hard to identify, nail down, pin down. I'll be honest, as we read this text, I will be giving my opinions. And I would say with that explanation, the realist versus the anti-realist, I would say I'm an anti-realist in this sense, that science should give us conceptual tools to understand and deal with the universe. If you think different, let me know. So, disagreement over realism lies at the heart of the nomological versus causal disputes about explanation and the nature of scientific theories. Science explains the world with theories, whether they are regarded as true, the causal realist view, or merely useful, the nomological anti-realist view. Savage identifies three broad approaches to theories, with many variations within. One, the syntactic view, holding that theories are axiomatized collections of sentences. Two, the semantic view, holding that theories are counterfactual models of the world. And three, a view we call naturalism, holding that theories are amorphous collections of ideas, values, practices, and exemplars. From this melange, I have chosen to discuss these three issues of particular relevance to psychology. First, I will discuss the granddaddy of syntactic views, the received view on theories, which has greatly influenced psychology. Second, I will briefly consider the semantic view of theories as models, which take us to the final topic of this section, theory testing. The naturalistic viewpoint will be taken up in the following section on rationality. So I guess that's more about, anti-realism, right? In the sense like, how do we think about theories? Are theories essentially just, words? Are they views? Are they really based on nature? That's too deep. That's too deep right now. So we're going to continue reading tomorrow because I got class, and I feel like this is a good part to pick back up on it. So we're going to pick up with theories about scientific theories about scientific theories in our next reading. Hopefully you enjoyed this. I really enjoyed reading this text. I can't wait to break it all down. Is this nerdy of me? I really enjoy reading textbooks. I'm not going to lie. Reading textbooks make me feel like I'm just mainlining information, bro. You know what I mean? I'm just hit the vein, bro. You know what I mean? That's what it feels like whenever I read a full-on textbook. So yeah, that's what we're going to be doing. Let us know what you think of this text. Y'all be easy out there, and peace.